Hi, welcome to my session. My name is Dr. Godwin, and I will be facilitating today's session called William Faulkner Was Right, Why How We Talk About History Matters. The inspiration for this piece came from this quote, actually, that might be very familiar to you. The past is never dead. It's not even past. I thought about that quote, and it really made me reflect on my life as a K-12 social studies educator. It made me reflect on my life in higher education as a social studies teacher preparation program educator. And it really made me start to wonder on the way that the society that we are situated within is impacted by history. As you and I know, history is not potential energy. History is kinetic energy. We are all existing today as a result of the social, political, and economic decisions and consequences of those who came before us. So what I want you to consider today is, what do you think? Do you think that how we talk about history matters? If you think about it, here in the United States, studies have confirmed that schools here tend to be framed on Eurocentric ideologies. And that silences many of the voices and experiences that create the fabric of what is the United States of America. Even from the genesis of our great country, we have had voices that have existed outside of tradition, outside of other, outside of the norm, inside of other, inside, outside, checking boxes, intersectionalities. Our country is created of a fabric of people who have backstories. That is what creates the enriching voices in life and history that we have here in the United States. But if those voices are silenced, intentionally or unintentionally, then we're creating classrooms where students can either acclimate to the colonial mindset or not. And that means that students are being forced to choose between being included in their class culture or ostracizing themselves. Sometimes if you're asking your students to ostracize themselves or ask questions, you're asking your students to put themselves in danger. For example, questioning, why would we celebrate Thanksgiving if there's more to the story than just some pilgrims and some Indians, and they're sitting around and singing kumbaya? Like, if you're the person that asked the question, then maybe you're putting yourself in a dangerous position. Because the very nature of our country is a gumbo-style melting pot, that means that instruction should be based on more than only European ideologies. All voices are important. Recent attention to civil unrest has highlighted an underlying issue that many of us have been aware of for as long as public school has existed. And equal education doesn't necessarily mean an equal representation in school curricula. So adding other voices in instruction through social studies coursework, especially in history, particularly through the practice of storytelling, can provide the need and the necessity to be able to find the representation to truly show the voices, the people, the stories that exist here in the United States. Sometimes, even if you could consider stretching yourself beyond a colonial-based ideology that is instructional methods, where you have the teacher at the front of the classroom who is teaching and the students who are like receiving the message, if you can stretch beyond that, maybe that too could have an impact on the way that you talk about history. So I want you to consider this. Whose story are we telling? Are we telling everyone's story? Is that even possible? If you're teaching in an AP curriculum, then you remember a few years back in the document-based question, there used to be this additional document or additional voices component that was really powerful in that essay, where you would tell your students to stretch themselves and consider whose voice and what voice and how would the voice express themselves to discuss some kind of a historic phenomenon. So here, what I'm asking you to consider is the idea of the voice that is being heard and the voice that's not. If you consider this, that schools represent a microcosm of the society in which they're situated in, then you probably also agree that it's important that your instruction reflects not only the economic, political, and social situation of your own community, but also of the country. If you use primary and secondary sources in your classroom, that's a really great way for you to bring people's voices alive, to provide authentic voice to the narratives. What danger is there in a non-inclusive narrative? Well, for some, if you have this idea that some people will just not be heard, students will just think that that person was not there or that person was not important. If you allow students to have to acclimate to a culture of a socio-political space that is being presented to them intentionally or unintentionally, but you force that acclimation, that undermines the idea that we have this diverse fabric in our country. What I'd like you to think about is, are there ways that you could include diverse narratives in other classes, even other than history? Could you bring in your partners from English language arts? Could you bring in partners from science and mathematics? Could you bring in partners through having people discuss holidays that are either celebrated or not celebrated in a community? Or could you just create a classroom where students are having to not make that choice to be ostracized? How could you make your classroom a safe space for exploration of both other and traditional mindsets? Sometimes you have students who have limited exposure to history. That not only has a danger for them in a citizenship perspective, but also as themselves in their own agency. For example, Tara Westover in her book, Educated, discusses the impact of her lack of education. When she attended college, she didn't know what the Holocaust was. That was dangerous for her. That put her in danger because she was at a detriment. She didn't know what the Holocaust was. And so when she asked questions, people thought she was acting inappropriately. Some students that find themselves in similar situations could find that they don't know what they don't know. Tara Westover put this really well in her book. She said, if I could maybe reconcile myself with the fact that the history that most people agreed on was not the history I had been taught, I could move forward. I think that shows the power that we as historians and history educators have in the work that we do. The plight of Tara should not be taken lightly. In becoming educated about the collective past from multiple perspectives, the student can also become liberated. It's therefore the duty of public school teachers, historians, and other educators to help expose students to a collective past that includes voices, stories, and cultures that enrich a student's understanding of their own community and country. Here are some ideas to help create better understandings of the past. Folk culture, which is an instructional framework that advocates for the inclusion of stories, not only in daily interactions, but also in instructional mindsets, can help students grapple with what they think the objective truth may be. If we step away from the science of teaching and remember that stories were once regarded with the same truth that we give science in today's world, then storytelling in a classroom becomes a necessary component to not only history instruction, but also social and emotional well-being. Stories are provided to students every day in varying contexts throughout this school year, including in narratives that are found in content classrooms, holidays that are celebrated, content in television programs, information they are exposed to on social media. Many schools may choose to maintain a foundational practice of acceptance for one ideology without providing a context for those who might not choose to accept the story of that holiday without asking questions. And those students with alternative perspectives may be made fun of or just disregarded altogether simply because they ask for more information or don't understand what's happening in a certain holiday because of their own understandings and ideologies. If you consider storytelling as an act of preservation, then you can also think about how we talk about history mattering. So storytelling is also a way to keep a story alive. For students, knowing who they are in history increases the probability that students will develop a deeper sense of purpose for their lives. And it gives their existence in the world a greater meaning when they know about those who struggled so that they could have the opportunities that they have now. That was by Principal Barute Kefeli. He also says that we should take the time to make sure that the histories of the students and the communities are being taught so that students can have ownership in who their ancestors were, so they know the shoulders that they're standing on in today's life. One way to make people move forward with story and new ideologies is to celebrate differences rather than going out of your way to say that one or the other is better or best. Sharing, learning, understanding, and cooperating can be better achieved in school communities by providing multiple stories from multiple perspectives each time any story is shared in an educational setting, because stories are powerful tools that can reinforce an ideal. So you can also use stories to create cautionary tales depending on the context, the content, and the reward in the stories. There are also different reasons for and methods of storytelling. Oral tradition is a method of cultural preservation in indigenous cultures, and it's well known among tribal members, even those who have grown away from the reservation life, that storytelling is a way to preserve and continue our cultural identity as indigenous people. Chief Dan George is known for saying, "If the legends fall silent, who will teach the children our ways?" That quote urges the continuity of oral tradition in order to preserve the cultural mindset associated with tribal living. But storytelling is not left to the realm of a racial or cultural norm. The importance of storytelling is what created pop culture. For example, comic books and graphic novels are a form of storytelling, which have been used in a directly informative way, not only to entertain, but also to instruct. Researchers in Romania attempted to create comics in French to motivate students to want to learn French in order to read the comics. And it worked. Here, I want you to think about how you could conceptually frame this idea. What would you do to create a conceptual framework in your classroom that would make you think about how you talk about history? What would you bring in? Would you bring in different voices? Would you bring in different speakers? Would you encourage your students to allude to those who have been silenced? Would you acknowledge that you don't know everything about something that's happened in the past? What would your conceptual framework be in implementing this kind of instruction in your classroom, where you consider carefully how you're talking about history? I have an idea for you. If you want to create a shift in the habits of mind that may intentionally or unintentionally be being transmitted in your classroom or in your method of instruction, maybe think about the way that you can include other perspectives. Maybe try constructivism, yes, but what about objectivism as well, in which this idea is that there is an objective truth and we all need to work together to find what it is. By adopting an objectivist approach to teaching, it helps your students stay focused not only on what the idea is, but that there's one truth and there are multiple perspectives from multiple players, but that the phenomena being discussed will never truly be understood. We will never truly understand what it meant to be at the Battle of Little Bighorn. We will never truly understand what it meant to stand on the shores of Pearl Harbor as it was being bombed. We'll never understand fully and completely these historic phenomena, but we can analyze and look for voices and hear stories to better understand and try to find what that truth is. This is something historians do every day. but we need to encourage our students to do that as well. So how can we incorporate more stories? How can we normalize the idea of hearing what everyone has to say? In order to create unity, we must acknowledge and celebrate differences. This is also supported by the new roadmap for educating toward an American democracy that was recently released in March of 2021 by the National Endowment for the Humanities. All voices should be celebrated and heard. One way of achieving that goal is to actively seek out cultural expressions that share authentic perspectives from multiple angles. You could discuss each voice as an authentic part of the fabric that makes up that culture and find ways to mark similarities and differences that are found therein. For example, stories of practicing resilience through motivation in times of need abound in cultures around the world, including in the starfish story, as well as in the hummingbird story. Those stories are found in different regions of the globe and are told in different contexts by different storytellers. But both tell a story of an individual overcoming adversity in order to do what they must to help their community. Television shows and movies are a great way of storytelling in today's world. Use that medium of storytelling that your students are already exposed to actively seek examples of unity and cooperation that can reinforce unity and cooperation in your classroom or educational setting. In turn, that cooperation will resonate in your community. Think of ways to point your students toward television shows that normalize cross-cultural identities and cooperation. Think of films and movies and songs and groups that normalize cross-cultural unity and cooperation. From an academic perspective, there are many resources that are available that have 3 components that can really help bring authentic voice and other stories to the table for yourself and for your students. The Fordham-Halsall Internet Sourcebook provides a wealth of information ranging from the medieval Internet Sourcebook to issues on gay and lesbian rights and lives throughout time. You can also find the Jewish Internet Sourcebook. There are so many topics and voices that are represented in the Fordham-Halsall Internet Sourcebook. Stories That Move, which is a project by the Anne Frank House, provides different stories in different contexts for students to explore so that they can learn more about what issues like oppression, discrimination, genocide look like in varying perspectives. UNESCO also offers free online workshops. These topics at the UNESCO forums are varied in range, in time, in breadth, in who you hear from. For example, recently there was a presentation on childhood after atrocity crimes. There was also a presentation on women and genocide. These discussions provide robust backgrounds and authentic voice and perspectives that acknowledge that there is an objective truth that we're all reaching toward. That also brings us together in interest and in earnest and in a need to provide voice representation to all. So if you wrote something as you were listening to this presentation, what did you change? Did anything change in your ideas? Why? Why not? Do you think that William Faulkner was right? Do you think that the past is never dead, that it's not even past? Do you think that if we continue to talk about history the same way, then we will continue to never leave it? If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, ideas, feelings, or needs about this presentation, please feel free to contact me. My email address is agodwin@shsu.edu. I would love to hear from you. Here are some references that you can check out as well that support what was discussed in today's presentation. Thank you so much.